Thank you very much for having me. It's always an honor and a pleasure to come to Geneva at GCSP and to present the result of our research at the Institute for Economics and Peace. So I'm going to talk to you a little bit about the Institute, explain you who we are, and then I will dive deeper into the key findings, results, trends, shifting landscapes of terrorism worldwide. So the Institute is a non-partisan and non-for-profit think tank with headquarters in Sydney, Australia, and our aim is to build a greater understanding of the key drivers of peace and also link this to the economic benefits that a peaceful situation creates. So next to the data-driven research that we do, we are trying to also communicate the results of this research, make sure that a maximum amount of people worldwide can take profit of the results of our research. This leads us to an annual media global reach of more than 5 billion people that are basically targeted or that accessed our research, more than 800 million hits on the internet and social media. And as said, we have the headquarters in Sydney, Australia. We have other offices in New York City for the Americas that is also managing the office that we have in Mexico City, as we produce annually a global a Mexican Peace Index. In Europe, The Hague and Brussels, where I am leading the operations, and in Harare, Zimbabwe. So those are our satellite offices next to the headquarters in Sydney, Australia. We do research for a lot of international organizations, and we were grateful and thankful to be ranked in the top 15 most impactful think tanks in the world last year. The Global Terrorism Index, as said, it's in its sixth year. We rank 163 countries because we need to have a certain level of statistical basis. So some of the countries do not have the size, neither of the territory or the population to be able to be ranked. But those 160 countries represent more than 99% of the world population. What we measure is the relative impact of terrorism, and when I will explain you the methodology in the next slide, you will understand better what I mean by the relative impact of terrorism. Terrorism is only one of the 23 indicators we use when we create the Global Peace Index, which is our main publication every year in June. So we are developing the index, and we are guided by a panel of worldwide international experts. So this is the methodology. I would say from an academic perspective, you always need to start from with a definition, so you are able to collect your data according to a definition. We work together with the START consortium at the University of Maryland, which has been compiling the Global Terrorism Database since 1970, and with those data we are creating an index. So we have identified 4 different indicators, and we have weighted those indicators. Those indicators are the amount of incidents, amount of injuries, amount of people killed, and property damage, with a different weight to every indicator. What we also do, we identify terrorism as an act of violence, but a specific act of violence that is also creating a persistent perception of fear and vulnerability. So the goal of terrorism is to install fear in your mind and in your society. So this is why we also try to look at the effects, this type of effect over a period of 5 years after attacks have occurred. And we, of course, use logarithmic banding scores. This is a statistical tool that we use to make sure that we are able to reflect the relative impact. For example, when your level of terrorism is 0 and you go from 0 to 10, this is different from a country where the levels are high, for example 1000, and when they shift from 1000 to 1010. So by applying those logarithmic banding scores, we try also to depict this in the index. Once the index is done, and most of you have either the index or a briefing in your hands, we also compare this or try to find correlation with a lot of data that we have in the socio-economic sector. So when we look at the results, there is good news and bad news as every year. The good news is that in the past year we saw a fall of the amount of death by terrorism by 27%. If we go back to the peak of terrorism in 2014, we see that in the last 3 years we saw a fall of 44%. So that is very good news. We see that in the index, a lot more countries improved their scores, 94 countries, and only 46 countries deteriorated. When we look at Europe, we see that the amount of death fell by 75%. That is very good news. When we look at the data, so when the 2018 Global Terrorism Index is looking at the data collected in 2017, we already have an outlook to October 2018. This year in Europe, only 8 people have been killed by terrorism. So we see that this positive trend in the amount of death that are caused by terrorism is continuing in 2018 also, and is even more stronger this year than it was the years before. This is very good news, but there is another side to this very good news. The amount of attacks increased last year. So we have more attacks that are less successful and are creating less casualties. So this is the reality in Europe. So the two negative points to finish this slide, far-right terrorism is on the rise. So this is it's still a minor phenomenon when you look at the amount of attacks and the amount of casualties. And normally later in the presentation I might have another slide really showing you the figures about far-right terrorism. But still in the last 4 to 5 years, we see a steady incrementation of the amount of the activities of far-right terrorists. And what we can say is that terrorism is still a global phenomenon, with 67 countries who suffered more than one death and more than one attack. So if we continue with the findings, we see that 5 countries, and those are the usual suspects. Those are the countries that are always in the bottom 5 of the index for the past, or since we created it. So we talk about Nigeria, Iraq and Syria, and Afghanistan and Pakistan. And we see that Somalia is getting closer and closer also this year. So we see 5 countries recording more than 1,000 deaths and 19 countries recording more than 100 deaths. We also see that the 2 biggest deteriorations in scores are for Somalia and Egypt. But there is a comment to say about this. Both are very high this year, have a deterioration in their scores for a single attack in those countries in 2017. So in Somalia, the most deadly attack of 2017, with a car bomb next to a fuel truck on a market, killing more than 588 people. Al-Shabaab, and Egypt with Al-Qaeda in the Sinai province, attacking a mosque and killing more than 330 people. So those were 2 single events, very deadly, the 2 most deadly events in 2017. As we tell every year, more than 99% of terrorism deaths occur in countries that are engaged either in a violent conflict or countries in which there is a high level of political terror. So when we talk about terrorism in Europe or in Western Europe, we are dealing with a phenomenon in the last percent of what terrorism represents on a global scale. We see a shift of terrorism, so we have identified 3 new or 3 hotspots, or 3 renewed hotspots of terrorism. So we are looking at Al-Qaeda on the rise and ISIL still present, and also spreading again into the Maghreb and the Sahel. We are looking at Boko Haram being crushed by security forces and by military intervention in Nigeria, but on the other hand, in the middle belt of Nigeria, we see the Fulani extremists that are becoming more active and also more deadly. And then we see a shift, as it is written on the slide, from terrorism to East Asia, especially in countries like Myanmar and the Philippines, who really deteriorated also in the index this year. When you look at the amount of death by Daesh or ISIL, we see a fall of 52%, but still, even with this fall of 52%, Daesh is the most deadliest group in the world. We see very good news for Iraq and Syria. Those are the 2 biggest improvers, with death down by more than 5,500 in Iraq and more than 1,000 casualties in Syria. When you look at the death from terrorism over the last 20 years, you can see that in the current wave of mostly Islamist-driven terrorism, you see small wrinkles or different smaller waves. Of course, the very successful attack in New York and Washington on 9/11. Then you see another increase or another impact with the start of the Iraq War in 2003. You see a positive impact with the US troop surge and the start of negotiation and collaboration with the Sunni tribe leaders in 2007 in Iraq. And then 2011-12, the Arab Spring, I would say several conflicts in this region, intervention, no intervention, so an exponential growth between 2011-12 and the peak in 2014, and then a very also impressive decrease after 2014 in the year 15-16 and as said in 2017. So the question you can ask yourself is, are we effective, or are our counterterrorism measures effective? When you look at the figures, you could say yes. So we foiled, especially when I look at Western Europe or Europe, a lot of attacks were foiled, much more than we did before. So we see an increased proficiency and efficiency also from our intelligence services and counterterrorism services. This is inside our societies. And then we, of course, see the action of international coalitions, both in Iraq and Syria over the past years, that have been very successful by tackling the threat where it emerges and where it has a fertile soil to also thrive and develop. And we see we saw something comparable for Boko Haram in northwest of Nigeria, where from one side the Nigerian defense forces had a very for us positive and for Boko Haram negative effect, really pressing them almost out of Nigeria or having a large impact on their operational capabilities. And on the other hand, with the multinational joint task force in the Lake Chad Basin, making sure that Boko Haram could not just cross the border and find new resources in the neighboring countries. So those actions have been successful. Both groups have been targeted, crushed in most of their capabilities, and counterterrorism activities have also became also more efficient in Europe or inside our own nations. So when you look at the amount of death in and I think we have a problem in the PowerPoint versions, but I think the slide is still okay. Number one, so the most impactful, so the country in which there were the most amount of death is Afghanistan this year, 25%, followed by Iraq with 23%. This is really disturbing also because Iraq, for the past 5 years, have been the #1 impacted country. And if you look over a longer period of time, for 10 to 15 years, Iraq has been up there for more than 80% of the time. So you see already there a shift also of Afghanistan becoming more and more targeted by terrorist activities from both the Taliban and ISIL also. We see an evolution of the Taliban. We saw it in 2017. We continue to see it in 2018, where the Taliban are shifting back into, I would call it more of an insurgency rather than a terrorist group, where they would target more military units and security forces units rather than indiscriminate civilian targets. So the largest, it's working again. The largest decrease is in death from terrorism in the last 2 years. So I already spoke about Iraq, more than 5,500 less. Syria, more than 1,000 less. And then the other countries are listed also. So this is very positive news. The largest increase, always spoke about Somalia and Egypt, where 2 single attacks created really this peak in 2017. This disturbing news coming from a couple of African countries, Afghanistan and Myanmar, and the Philippines in East Asia and Southeast Asia. Something you see also India peaking there on the 9th position. When you look at the top 10, and you can almost expand it to the top 15, top 20 of countries most impacted by terrorism, you will see that the majority of them, almost all of them, are impacted by Islamist terrorism. India is a special case in this list, in the bottom 10 of the index. India is targeted by another type of terrorism. It's most targeted by internal turmoil and terrorism created by these differences within India, and also by cross-border terrorism, especially in the northeast. The 4 deadliest groups, so Boko Haram, Daesh or ISIL, the Taliban and Al-Shabaab. So you see that for 3 of them there has been a decrease in their activity and in their efficiency in the past 3 years. The only group that is almost constantly increasing its efficiency has been Al-Shabaab over the past 4 to 5 years. We also calculate the economic impact of terrorism in US $1 billion, and this over the last 17 years, When you look at 2017, there is a clear decrease in the economic impact, and we calculated the impact to an amount of $52 billion in 2017. Those figures are very conservative. We look, of course, at the impact of the injuries, of the casualties, and the property damages. The investment in counterterrorism is very difficult to, so those data are almost impossible to access or to evaluate, and those are not comprised in those 52 billion. So this 52 billion is really the impact of the attacks have had in 2017. So now if you look at some trends, this is showing you that terrorist organizations throughout the world, I would say, stick to their basics, sticks to their well-known techniques, tactics and procedures, and bombing and explosion, and on a second level, armed assault are still the most preferred tactics used by terrorist groups all over the world. We are also looking, and I think this is one of the most interesting slides in the presentation, also looking at the regions impacted over the years. If you take the top three regions, so the MENA region, South Asia and Sub-Saharan Africa, those represent 92% of all attacks and casualties over the past 15 years. So when we talk about terrorism, this terrorism is happening in those three regions. I think it's very important also to see the figures for Europe over the past 15 years, and especially to look at the figures for North America. And then compare this to the narratives that I used in those two regions, depicting terrorism as being the #1 threat to societies, or the #1 threat to security in the world. I think we can maybe draw two conclusions from this narrative. The first conclusion is Europe and Northern America, or the Western world as such, is a very secure world. Those are very secured societies, and when you get targeted in this the last % of this tiny bit of insecurity that you have to manage, the perception of vulnerability is it's much more important than in the other regions, where I would say, and we should never accept this, but I would say terrorism is becoming a routine. For example, on the 22nd of March 2016, I received text messages from friends in Kabul and in Baghdad asking me if I was okay. And I just replied and I asked him if I was now to send them 3 messages a day to ask them if they were okay every other day after that. And when you look at the weeks of the Paris attacks, or the week in which we had the Brussels attacks, I would invite you to also look at the other terrorist attacks that happened during the same week, and we do nothing about it. And they were even much more deadly than the ones in Brussels, or the ones or the attacks in Paris. So really, these three regions most impacted, and the shift that I'm going to talk about later also is shifting again within those three regions. And the largest decrease in terrorism occurred in Europe again in the past 3 years. And as you can see, terrorism is not really over 15 years, I would say, a matter of national security in North America. There again, this is a slide showing you the correlation between, first of all, the increase of casualties over the last 20 years, and I would say, especially from 2011, both by conflict, armed conflict, and terrorism, an exponential increase of the amount of death worldwide. So we have an increase over the last almost 20 years by 400% of the casualties. I think this is disturbing. But what you also see is a correlation between the amount of victims created by armed conflict and the amount of victims created by terrorism over the years. This is also same type of data, but another type of presentation. So this is in cooperation with the Uppsala University, UCDP. They consider war, a situation of war, a conflict in which there are more than 1,000 casualties, a minor armed conflict between 25 and 1,000, and non-conflict less than 25. So this is exactly also showing you the correlation between armed conflict and terrorism, and presenting to you this figure of 94% of all death occurring in countries suffering from conflict. This is showing you the evolution of the amount of deaths from terrorism, both in Western Europe and in Northern America. So we have seen that a rise every year in both Western Europe and Northern America from 2013 to 2016, then kind of a plateauing and then a decrease afterwards. This is a slide showing you ISIL activity or Daesh activity in Western Europe and North America over the past 4 years, so since Daesh started to exist. I think it's very important to see also the different colors in the slide, where you will see that some countries have been very impacted by Daesh, and France is a very good example of this in first position. But then you will find other countries, and you will find that those countries also impacted by terrorism have been impacted by another type of terrorism than Islamist terrorism. I think this is a very interesting slide also. This is showing you the rise. So these are the figures that I promised you before. This is showing you the rise of far-right extremism and terrorism death and incidents in the past 10 years. As you can see, as I said before, it's still a very minor phenomenon, but I think it's interesting to see this increase and this rise of the impact of this type of terrorism worldwide and in specific countries in particular. So now, the shifting landscape. So what did happen in the past, or since the peak in 2014, what happened in the past 2-3 years? So as I said before, the international coalition was able to reduce the access to resources of Daesh, or reduce Daesh to about 1 to 5% of what it was at its peak in 2014, 2015. So we are dealing with the terrorist organization that has very reduced access to resources and very reduced capacities to impact us also. So on one hand, this is very good news, and as I said before, on the other hand, it's also bad news, because as we took away the capability to plan, execute, command and control very sophisticated, very complex type of terrorist acts, also very efficient terrorist acts, we force them to shift towards, I would say, makeshift terrorist attacks. And this is why, instead of having the years in which we had a couple of very efficient attacks, especially in Western Europe, we are now facing a phenomenon that is much more difficult to understand, much more difficult to track, and much more difficult to prevent also. Basically, anybody in society can wake up on a blue Monday morning having a bad day, and it's almost like this movie when this character is having a bad morning and it's a bad life, and then turns into a very violent person. And when you look at this, you can identify the homegrown terrorist fighters in Europe or in the western part of the world that at any point of time can just transform into a terrorist and just commit a violent act. Those acts, of course, are not efficient at all, so you will see no casualties or very low levels of casualties. But as I said before, this represents an increase in the amount of attacks that were recorded in 2017. So when you look at the phenomenon of terrorism, you can see that the efficiency in the amount of injuries and the amount of deadly casualties is not high anymore, but they are still achieving their goals, and I would say even better achieving a goal of installing a permanent perception of vulnerability and fear, as you have these repeated amounts of attacks occurring, I would say almost on a daily or on a weekly basis throughout Europe and throughout Europe most of the time. I spoke to you about the 3 hotspots before. These are figures showing the shift towards Southeast Asia, and this is caused most of the time by Islamist groups and separatist groups. This slide is showing you the evolution of terrorism in 2 countries over the past almost 10 years. So Myanmar on the top and the Philippines on the bottom. So you will see that the island of Mindanao in the Philippines is becoming more and more targeted by Islamist groups like ISIL, who really shifted down to Southeast Asia. But also this communist guerrilla is also very active in this country. So this This is one example. And I remember last year when the GTI was presented, that the first questions arose about the movement of terrorist fighters throughout the world. And a lot of people in Europe feared like a massive return of those terrorist fighters to Europe. I don't think this was ever in the plans of Daesh to send those fighters back to Europe. Really from a military perspective, when you look at your elite troops, you will always put them there where they will be the most efficient. I think this is going back for decades and centuries. Like in the military, you always use your best troops in the vulnerable point of your enemy. Sending them back to Europe was basically sending them back to the strongest point of the enemy. So the most organized, where the security services were and the intelligence services were best organized. And where you had a lot of different troops called homegrown terrorist fighters that could also perpetrate your action and make sure that, as I explained before, this sentiment of fear would be permanently installed within the Western societies. So from a strategic military point of view, the Daesh commanders, looking at the map of the world, have easily identified all those regions in which low levels of governance and almost non-existing or non-efficient security and intelligence forces were waiting for them. So what they did was just like encrust themselves in existing conflicts, in existing tensions, in countries or in regions of the world with low levels of governance and low levels of effective security services and security forces. And this is what happened in the past, and this is what is still happening today. This is showing you another evolution for Nigeria, where you effectively see that Boko Haram has been targeted, as I explained before, by military forces and security services. But on the other hand, you see an expansion and an increase in the impact of the Fulani extremists in the middle belt of Nigeria. So about terrorist recruitment, this slide is showing you figures about the percentage of foreign fighters with a criminal background. So we can all recall 9/11 and the attacks on the Twin Towers in New York and the Pentagon in Washington. This commando, this crew, and this entire crew were highly educated people with degrees from very good universities in medical sciences, in engineering. I mean, they had to be able to pilot an airliner also, and to pilot it very well into those two towers. So we see effectively, when you look at Daesh today, their type of recruitment is completely different. There are other reasons for radicalization in the three regions that are most impacted. When you look back, those are the 99%, so political terror and armed conflict. When you look at the last 1%, you effectively look at social economic factors, discrimination, alienation, they do not see themselves as being part of the society they live in. The fact that those people are criminals or they have a criminal background in the first place, there is a reason for that. And those are those socioeconomic factors: alienation, discrimination. When you imagine the work of a recruiter, they are not going to come for you and me, because I think that in this room we are all at a level of violence at zero or close to zero, but they are looking at people that already through their lives or through their young lives have identified or have went through the process that violence could also lead them to certain goals. So people already accepted the use of violence to achieve goals. And basically the recruiter will just approach those people who already live in those conditions that will make it easy for him to take him away from his own environment, from his own community, and also an easy job just to go from a level of self-radicalization in violence. I mean, themselves may be radicalized already for 75–80%, and then the recruiter just take them along the road for the last 20–25%. So it's an easy job for them. If they would come to me or all of you, they will have to walk the entire 100% and really radicalize you all the way into violence. So they're looking at the easy targets, and as I said, most of the targets already have a criminal background, but there is also a reason why they have a criminal background. And this is the state of our societies that are creating discrimination and that are making it possible for a lot of young people not to feel a member of the community anymore, especially with a certain migration background and with a certain religious background also. So this is one part. The other part is this the redemption narrative of Daesh, of a group like ISIL, where they make you believe that you are a zero in your current situation, in the society you live in, and they show you another type of society in which you would be a hero and really somebody that would be part of this society, part of this community, and would be respected in the new community. So it's really a push-pull factor, push-pull effect there in radicalization. Foreign fighters by country, I think it's or by region. By region, I think it's really interesting to look at this also. So you can see that most of the terrorist fighters, or most of people who engage with Daesh, come from the MENA region, followed by Russia and Eurasia, and Europe as number 3. You can also look at the amount of people who returned. So the dark blue part of the histogram are either people who are not of this world anymore, or people that are still fighting for the cause. And then there are a lot of data about foreign terrorist fighters, also classifying the type of returnees that you can encounter, and I would say also the type of treatment or that you would need to give to those returnees. I think when you look at this slide, it's very obvious to see that Western countries would choose more for criminalization, imprisonment, and would take away the maybe double nationality or the citizenship of the passport, where countries really impacted by the phenomenon. So in those regions and countries that are most affected by terrorism, we look more at de-radicalization programs and rehabilitation. A last comment about this slide. When we talk about reintegration, we should ask ourselves if they have ever integrated in our society before. Maybe we should go through the first steps of integration within our society. And that was it. So thank you very much for your attention. This is how you can connect with us. So all the data are available on our website, and please support us and follow us on social media also. And I'm looking forward to your questions afterwards.
So I'm going to look a little bit at the global context, some of our failed strategies. Then I will focus a little bit on the new terrorist modus operandi, and finally some strategic considerations, or hopefully some solutions. Just to give you also another fact, if you look at the global war on terror, which 17 years ago started, nearly 500,000 people have died. And it has been a cost of 5.9 trillion. This is just for the US cost. And there was a document that just came out in August. It was a University of Brown project, Costs of War, and it looked at the deaths also in the past 2 years have been rising. So even though terrorism is down, there are other parts of the world that are in trouble. I wanted to also talk a little bit about the two decades of US-led counterterrorism operations. Where are we now since 9/11? If you look at the Salafi jihadist threat, it is actually 4 times as great as it was during the period of 9/11. And if you look at the evolving terror threats and how different leaders are facing these threats, you see that now just one country, the US, is trapped in 4 ongoing wars in Afghanistan, Iraq, Syria, and Yemen. And there's no clear prospect of ending or victory of those wars. How can you defeat a country today in terms of how will that country develop in foreign politics and government? You cannot have a country stable if you don't have a government, if you don't have a stable governance in order to continue and be peaceful. So these tactical victories that are happening are not really working. And so what is really victory today? It's where you have a military victory, but also a civil victory, where people are actually on board with the government in charge. And I think this is getting more and more difficult to find political unity, effective governance, and economic progress in the countries that are now in conflict. And again, if you look at the world statistically, 1.7 billion people are living in fragile and conflict-ridden states. That's an enormous amount of people that are at risk. And at the same time, we are misdiagnosing the threats. If you look at the Barack Obama regime and also, of course, Bush, they had the idea of political reform, of changing the Middle East, and making the Arab world reform. If you look at this new Trump administration, what he is looking more for is unconditional support of governments who have vowed to reform Islam. But he's actively working with countries that are extremely autocratic and very, very, very interesting, as you can. I'm trying to be diplomatic here. So there's a misguidance in diagnosing the threat. The threat is there and it's evolving. At the same time, if you think about it, Salafi jihadism has to be fixed. There's not one single cure to this disease. There's so many things, so many actors in play. It's ultra-conservative religious ideas. It's peer pressure, young people pulling each other into this movement. It's poor governance. It's poor justice. It's poor prisoner rehabilitation. We see that in our own prisons here in Europe. It's youth unemployment. If you think about it, in the 1.7 billion fragile states that are in conflict, how many of those kids, young people, have access to jobs or economic development or even hope? I mean, this is a very unhopeful time and period in our world. And state fragility and civil war is prevalent. So all these factors are still at play, the ones that I just mentioned, in the Middle East, in sub-Saharan Africa, and increasingly in parts of Asia. So the threat of terrorism is definitely the recipe for disaster, you could argue, is still there. So I just wanted to highlight what are the things that we need to focus on in order to help this. Well, one of the upcoming threats in terrorism is drones. As you probably all see, your kids probably all have asked to have a drone for Christmas. They're prevalent. They're all over. You can order them on Amazon, and that's exactly what terrorists are doing today. I'm going to talk a little about drones, smartphones, encryption communications, the dark web, the deep web, and poisons. So drones are everywhere, and they're growing. And what's really interesting and worrisome is that they are now used as a strategic asset to many of the different terrorist groups. They're hacking into drones. They're using drones as intelligence, for surveillance, so they can attack places better. But they also are using them now to drop explosives. And even more worrisome, they have drone factories. So they're making their own drones. They're not all ordering them. And if you think about 3D printing in the future, if they get some printers and can actually print their own drones, they could print up to 300 drones a day if they get a bunch of printers. So this is kind of, again, worrisome statistics that we're looking at. Another thing that we're increasingly worried about is smartphones. Today, everyone has them, right? And they're ubiquitous. In the future, they're going to grow in the world. More and more people will have the access to smartphones. Still today, not everyone has access to smartphones. But never in history have terrorists had such access to our minds and our eyes as they do today. I mean, everyone who has a smartphone can be hacked. And even if you can't read, you can be sort of moved into this terrorist mindset by snuff videos that can be loaded up on your phones by terrorist groups, which is what they do. They actually put videos on phones to generate the people to follow them. Now, if you look at smartphones, you can see that they're growing, and the market is growing in Asia Pacific, in North America, but increasingly in the rest of the world. So more and more, the people that are vulnerable to militant Salafi jihadism are going to have a phone, and this will give people more access to them. And how do you bomb an ideology? How do you bomb an idea? I mean, we can continue killing the singers, but what about the song? What are we doing about that? So, and the more they have this strategic failures in the world, in the battle space, the more they are looking at their ideological agenda. And if you can see, one of the most successful things that they do is their ideology, the way they communicate, the way they are fluid and are using the latest modus operandi on Twitter feeds, and I will go that in a second, but they use this kind of ideological agenda, and they're engaging more and more in propaganda and in fundraising. And these are, of course, their tools of the trade. They're working in the deep web, where you can get invited to join different forums, but more and more they have moved into the dark web since the Snowden revelations. So you see in the dark web, they can ask for Bitcoin, they can order arms, they can communicate with one another without our intelligence agencies always having access to them. I'm not saying that some intelligence agencies don't have access to some of the places in the dark web, but most of them, it's becoming increasingly difficult. So they are going dark. Another thing is, of course, Telegram channels. They're more and more using Telegram channels, and they're very proficient in many different languages. This is just a couple of the languages that they have, but according to some academics, they have up to 30 languages that they communicate with on Telegram channels. And of course, their publications are prevalent and can be easily found and downloaded on the internet. Now, these publications, you might argue, are just, publications. People will look at them, they won't really take them serious. But if you look at the publications, they're giving lots of guidance on how to attack. They give a guidance on how to build bombs, and they give a guidance on all the new kinds of threats. And what they can't do themselves now, of course, is available on the internet. They can buy malware, they can buy malware protection services, they can even buy intrusion services. So a lot of the hackers are for hire on the web, and it's become hacker for service, where literally they act as businessmen. And like the Amazon, where you can order books and other items, you can now order hackers in the deep web if you want. One of the kind of new modus operandi now of the Salafi jihadism is that they've created a new kind of cyber caliphate. I wrote a paper about this, and what they did in April was they united 4 or 5 different groups, the United Cyber Teams, Cyber Caliphate Army, the Ghost Caliphate Section, and they united into a United Cyber Caliphate. What does the United Cyber Caliphate do? Well, it does many things. First of all, it doxes victims. I don't know, this is kind of called a new type of cyber terrorism, where they out people. They tell people, for example, they doxed 8,700 military people, 7,000 US and a couple more from the United Kingdom. And what they do is they print their addresses and where they live, and they say, go kill them. So they're asking lone wolves to go out and hunt down these people. So this is I would call cyber terrorism. This is becoming a new threat, and something that we need to look at. At the same time, they have been given a lot of new opportunities. 2 recent opportunities was WikiLeaks published details on how the CIA can perform surveillance and cyber warfare. And another leak, so to speak, was Equation Group was hacked, which was a company working for the U.S. National Security Agency, a subcontractor. And when they hacked them, shadow brokers hacked them, and what they did is they got cyber weapons. And they took the cyber weapons and they put them up for sale for Bitcoin, so for currencies, cryptocurrencies. So these 2 kind of opportunities now have given the cyber caliphate kind of new ammunition, so to speak. We have yet to see how this evolves in the future. Another worrisome new trend in terror is the use of poisons. And we've seen in Germany a biofoiled ricin attack plot, which was foiled happily. But when the German security services uncovered the plot, which was a Tunisian living in Cologne, he was learning from two ISIS operatives, one how to make the poison, and how one was teaching him how to spread it. And when he was found out, he had already 84.3 milligrams of ricin in his apartment. Now, a very tiny amount, minute doses of this poison is lethal, and there is no antidote. So this is a really new worrisome threat. And what was interesting is the Germans who learned about this threat found it out from a British surveillance, British electronic surveillance, who saw this guy buy castor beans on the internet, as well as a coffee grinder on Amazon. So, and finally, I have one last truck attacks. Of course, we've learned that this is a now lethal and very scary new method of attacking. But what's interesting about the truck attacks is you can see that the diffusion of how new tactics are diffused online has grown dramatically, and the idea of new attacks are pushed out into their environment, and they're learning more. The other thing, of course, and it was mentioned by Serge, was the rise of white supremacist terrorist ideology, especially in the US. Active hate groups are growing, and this is also very troublesome and worrisome because these two groups will feed each other, and it will be sort of a new cycle of terror. So in a nutshell, what I wanted to highlight is what are some of the new threats in the terror domain, the problem of how do we counter these threats in the ideology domain, but also in the physical space and in the virtual space. We'll have one solution, so I'm not all telling you all these terrible things. There's always hope, and that's why I've kept Khalid for the end, because he will give us all a lot of new hope. But UN Security Council Resolution 2178 is obligating all people, all countries in the world to design a national action plan on prevention. So what I'm arguing is conflict and war is not working. That's what I hope to deliver today. It's not working. But prevention, building resilience to young minds, making sure that they won't join terrorist groups, this is what we have to focus on. So it's all about prevention, building resilience, because every kid will have a phone. So every kid can be vulnerable. They can even be attacked while playing a video game. And these guys are smart. They know what they're doing. So in order to really look at a more brighter future, we have to do prevention. And prevention is whole of society and whole of government. It's the bottom up. The teachers, the colleagues, the peers of a kid is much more important than we are, the parents. I can tell you that because I have two teenagers. Their peers are a lot more important to them than what I tell them. So it's really important to look at whole of society and whole of government approaches. And we at the GCSP are in a community of PV practitioners. We have lots of friends here where we work together. We design national action plans together. I run a course here at the GCSP on designing national action plans. And I really think that's the future. Every country has to build its own resiliency, and it has to organize its own action plan for its specific needs, because as we saw, terrorism is different in every part of the world, and young people are vulnerable in different parts of the world in different ways. So we are part of Friends of PVE. We deliver courses on PVE. We also have a dialogue platform on PVE where you can ask questions. And that's all I have to say for the moment. Now I'm going to pass the floor to Khalid Koser, but thank you so much. So yes, I get to introduce you. So Dr. Khalid Koser is not only the founding executive director of the Global Community Engagement and Resilience Fund, but he is also a former academic dean and deputy director of the GCSP. He has now reached over 2 million people in communities at risk. He's an academic, but also an expert on migration. And he's part of the World Economic Forum Global Futures Council on Migration. So he has many different hats, but you will speak to us on PVE, and I hope that you will give us hope, because I don't think I've made them very hopeful. Thank you.
Thank you, Chris. The only hope I can give you is I'll speak quickly, because I think we want time for our colleagues here to ask questions, especially about the excellent report. Let me start by thanking Christina and GCSP for the invitation. It's always a pleasure to come back to GCSP. I spent many happy years here, as you heard, as the academic dean and latterly the deputy director. Christina, congratulations on your excellent work in these areas and really raising the profile of these subjects here at GCSP. Let me also congratulate the Institute for Economics and Peace and Serge. I think this is a really excellent report. I commend it to all of you, and I really would encourage you to take the time to read it. It's authoritative, it's objective, I think it's intellectually stimulating, and it's beautifully produced. It's a really, really first-rate report. Serge, let me thank you personally for taking the time from your busy schedule to come and join us here in Geneva, and let me thank you for also being a board member for GSURF, the Global Community Engagement and Resilience Fund. 2 words on GSURF simply. I think 3 words. We have 3 hallmarks of GSURF. GSURF, the Global Community Engagement and Resilience Fund, is a global fund, which means it's a grant-making organisation. We give out grants. Secondly, our grants only go to local communities. These are very locally targeted small grants. And thirdly, a very clear and specific mandate on preventing violent extremism, the concept that you just kindly introduced to us, Christina. I haven't reached 2 million people, but we think our grants possibly have reached 2 million people. And let me also mention that GSURF was incubated here at GCSP, so we owe GCSP a great debt of gratitude for helping to launch this still relatively young new initiative. The Global Terrorism Index before you, I think, from a selfish perspective, really helps reinforce the argument that GSURF is also doing important work. I think there's a clear focus and argument for prevention that's made in the report that certainly bolsters our work on prevention. I note, regrettably, that many of the countries where GSURF is working still have a long way to go. All of the countries where we're currently present, Bangladesh, Kenya, Kosovo, Mali, Nigeria, the Philippines, possibly Myanmar, Tunisia as well, are there in the top 25, and clearly there's much more work to be done. I also note some of the regions and hotspots that you identify, the Sahel, we're working in Mali and Tunisia at the moment, the middle belt of Nigeria, another place where we're working at the moment. And I think the GTI also makes a very clear business case for the private sector engaging in preventing violent extremism, and GSURF as a multi-stakeholder outfit is certainly engaged with and interested in further engaging with the private sector. So thank you, Serge, and your team for writing a report that I think really helps reinforce the work of GSURF. It's immensely satisfying for us. I thought I'd just spend 2 minutes speaking about the expert contribution that I authored and co-authored with my colleague Lila Shumiki-Logan, and I really think an added value of this report is not just its wonderful and very authoritative data, not just its thematic expertise, but also the way it collects together some really quite, I think, thoughtful and controversial pieces at the end under the title of expert contributions. And I must also say, since so many colleagues from GSURF are here in the audience, that the work that Lila and I have written here builds on the foundations and the expertise of so many other colleagues out at the fund. And let me thank all of you for being here, and a special shout out to Adele and Rachel, whose very last day is today, and we wish you all the best as you go back to the United States after your internships. The backdrop to the argument that we make briefly in the report is that after, I suppose, a peak of interest in preventing violent extremism in around 2014, 2015, huge leaders summits hosted by President Obama at the time, we think there's been a drop-off of global interest in preventing violent extremism and something of a retreat from an interest in global approaches to preventing violent extremism to a reinforcement of a domestic national security agenda. And I think we can play that out in terms of funding, in terms of interest, in terms of political statements, and I think you can play it out fairly clearly that there's been a retreat. The international PVE agenda, I think, has dropped and is in a bit of a drop and a lull at the moment. There are some standouts. I would, for example, note that Japan, I think, is really playing a very important role in filling this gap and maintaining a focus on international preventing violent extremism. Interesting to ask why, and I haven't got time to do it here, but let me throw out a few ideas and we might have time during the discussion. One reason might be complacency. You look at the Global Terrorism Index, you see that terrorist deaths are down by 44%, and you think, well, we can take our foot off the pedal and relax now. I think we all intuitively understand that is incorrect, but I fear some complacency may be creeping in. Results. I think we all know, and GCSP is equally culpable, that we have not yet demonstrated the results of preventing violent extremism. That's because it's difficult and it's long-term and it's behavioural change and it's hard to prove the counterfactual, but it's hard to convince donors to continue to invest in something that hasn't yet demonstrated true impact. I think that would be a reasonable argument, I think, for many donors. It's probably something also to do with the regrettable turn, I think, against multilateralism and against globalism that we're seeing across all sorts of sectors, of course, not just preventing violent extremism and terrorism as well. So we at GCSP, of course, have a self-interest in trying to reverse this trend. We are a global fund focusing on global interventions around preventing violent extremism, and a retreat away from that interest to domestic security clearly is not in our interests as a fund. We think there are other reasons, by the way, not just to keep GCSP alive, that you should maintain an interest in international approaches to preventing violent extremism. One is to preserve the gains that the GTI shows have been made. Let's not rest on our laurels, let's not be complacent. Let's double our efforts, double the efforts we undertake to make sure that these gains that we appear to be making can be kept. I think there's a clear argument to maintain an international focus to try to prevent future risks. You've identified in your report, Serge, some hotspots, some places where there are growing risks and growing concerns. We should be focusing on those, and I think working there too. I also think that many of the quite young organizations that have been set up to work on international prevention of violent extremism are just beginning to reach their potential, are just beginning to develop some interesting data. This is not the time to withdraw, this is the time to really bank some of that data and make sure that the past investments are realized. Those are lovely arguments that may well hold some water in a GCSP in Geneva. I fear that they don't hold much water in many of the governments that we're working with at the moment. So what Lila and I have tried to do in our brief contribution to GTI is make a much more, if you like, politically savvy argument. And our argument is this: even if, and we regret this, but even if your only interest is domestic security, even if you are genuinely no longer interested in what's happening in Nigeria or Bangladesh or the Philippines, but your only concern is the streets of Paris or London or Washington, and that's legitimate, but even if that is your only concern, in order to succeed with that goal, you have to maintain a focus on international prevention of violent extremism. And that's very simply the argument that we're making. And we put out three, I think, fairly obvious arguments, and we try to illustrate them, and we're indeed writing another longer paper to try to fill them out a little bit more. One obvious argument is that even if you're trying to prevent violent extremism domestically with a national agenda, it is clear that the threats are transnational. And I think your interesting slides there, Cristhian, about the use of the web and smartphones and so on and so forth make that absolutely clear. What is being preached by a radical preacher in a mosque in Bangladesh is being listened to by members of the Bengali diaspora in Birmingham, quite obviously. And so I think it's very clear that there are global threats and global challenges that we need to confront and get on top of, even if all we're trying to do is domestically protect ourselves. We make a point in the piece, and I always do this when I come to GCSP, and I want to do it again. I don't want that argument to be extended to migration. I have a real concern that there is a misplaced link being made between migration and refugees and asylum and irregular migration and risks to our societies, especially around extremism and security. Of course, there are risks around migration, but I would argue very strongly indeed that the main link between migration and displacement and asylum and violent extremism is that people are fleeing the effects of violent extremism, not coming to our societies to perpetrate violent extremism. And that's a topic we might want to pick up on, but I just want to put that in as a caveat to the argument that there are global threats to national security. The second point that we make, and again, I think it's fairly obvious, and I think the business case is made beautifully in the GTI, is that increasingly there is a deterritorialization of national interests through trade and tourism and investment and military bases. You protect your domestic interests internationally because your domestic interests clearly have left, are beyond your boundaries and have been deterritorialized. And you look, for example, at the attack in Sousse a few years ago that killed British tourists. And you look at very clear evidence from Australia that mining interests from Australian mining companies are at threat in places like Mali. And it seems very clear to us that, again, even if all you want to do is protect national interests, you cannot do that without focusing on a more global perspective. And again, we play that out a little bit in the article. The third point we make, and I think this is frankly the least developed argument, but it's the one that I think excites me the most, is that many of our domestic efforts in wealthier countries, France, the UK, the US, are frankly not particularly effective. I think sometimes they trespass on human rights. I think sometimes they ignore community members. I think sometimes they overestimate Islam or religious extremism. Might it not be that there are lessons to learn from international perspectives that might improve our domestic responses? And I think you might play that in two ways. I think there are countries, and that little tick list you showed, Serge, was very interesting. I was in Saudi Arabia relatively recently, and there's some really interesting work taking place in Saudi Arabia around de-radicalization. So rather than just imprisoning people, there's a de-radicalization effort. And of course, we can have a discussion about Saudi Arabia and the regime and its approach to issuing visas in embassies and so on and so forth, but there may be lessons to learn from the places that some of us think are the beneficiary countries that are actually doing really exciting work. And even the countries that we're working in at GCSP, Bangladesh, Mali, Nigeria, they're developing national action plans. They're doing this stuff in quite a sensitive way. They're listening to mayors. They're playing this out at the local level. They're trying to involve communities. And I think sometimes they're doing it more effectively than perhaps we are in some of the richer countries. So lessons to learn from other countries around the world. Let's not be quite so patriarchal and Western-oriented about the way that we do this. And of course, the other argument about this is that simply there's a lot of data and information out there. And I think the more that we can learn and understand what is taking place and what modestly organizations like GCSP are doing might help inform better interventions within our countries. So three very simple arguments. There are global threats to domestic interests. Domestic interests have become increasingly deterritorialized. And there is also, I think, lessons to be learned in order to improve our domestic responses to domestic threats. And we think all three of those are accelerating quickly. I think the final point I'll make, just to end on a more, I suppose, conceptual note. I think all of this arises because preventing violent extremism is not yet seen as a global public good. It is seen basically as a national interest. And I think GCSP is not a think tank, GCSP is a think tank, but I see part of our role at GCSP is to try to make the case that preventing violent extremism is indeed a global public good, as important as stopping infant deaths, as important as education for children. I think if we don't get on top of violent extremism, the SDGs are under serious threat. And I think I'd make that case, and I think the GTI begins to spell that out. And I think the other thing that Lila and I debated as we wrote this piece, and we recognise I'd much rather write a piece saying international preventing violent extremism is important because people are dying and people are being displaced. And the fact that we had to make a domestic security argument, I think made us feel a little bit uncomfortable. And I suppose the ethical message here is that we believe that the ends justify the means. And if we have to use the language of domestic security in order to promote further investment in international efforts, then regrettably we think that's probably a price worth paying.
Thank you.